The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, we are getting to the bottom of the ever-growing movement of anti-intellectualism. We'll be speaking with David Robson, senior journalist at BBC Future, about misology, which is the hatred of reason and argument, and how it may be connected to distrust of intellectuals. Then we'll speak with Dr. Bruno Takahashi, Associate Professor of Environmental Journalism and Communication at Michigan State University, about how the way you consume media affects how you feel about scientists and the press and your scientific knowledge. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Anika Hazra. With me is David Robson, Senior Journalist at BBC Future. David, welcome to Science for the People.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so you have written a blog post on your website about misology. The post is titled Misology, the Hatred of Reason and Argument, which is great because you've explained what misology is right there in the title. So I actually have only heard of this term for the first time very recently, and I'm sure a lot of people have never encountered this term before. So could you explain for us in some detail what misology means?
Sure. So actually, I only came across the term recently too, and that was while I was doing research for this book I'm writing, I was reading Plato's Phaedo, which is about Socrates after his trial when he's been condemned for death. And there's this very deep philosophical discussion that they're having. And some of Socrates' followers they're kind of becoming confused and upset that their opinions keep on changing during this discussion. And they feel like maybe if their opinion can change so much and if they can be persuaded by one argument and then another, then they start to get distrustful of the idea of rational argument altogether. And that kind of distrust of rational argument and factual debate, that's really what misology is. And really, this is, I think Socrates said that was actually one of the worst things that could happen to someone, would be if they would develop this distrust of argument and rationality and factual knowledge, because it means that they really can't live a good life if they don't engage with the actual facts that are around them.
All right, so what led you to write about this particular topic?
So I'm writing this book called The Intelligence Trap, which is really looking at why even very intelligent, clever people can make stupid mistakes and how to avoid those mistakes. And the problem is that even people who should know better often do reject really good evidence. So, for example, there are lots of intelligent people who are climate change deniers, for example, or there's the famous case of Kary Mullis, who is a Nobel Prize winning chemist, but he has, or at least he did in the 90s, he rejected the idea that HIV was causing AIDS, even though there was really abundant evidence at that point that the two were linked. And so I was kind of wondering, why is it that people would reject something that's really plainly in front of them, in which, you know, the scientific consensus is there? Why would someone intelligent still just reject all of that knowledge?
And did you find an answer?
I did. So there's lots of good reasons why this could be, but one element that I find very interesting is this idea of, it's called earned dogmatism. And it's this idea that once you have developed an expertise in one area, and you kind of feel that you're very knowledgeable, that kind of creates this really closed-minded attitude, and that can kind of seep into other domains as well. So you start to think you know best about everything, and you rely more on your kind of intuitive responses, your intuitive ideas, rather than listening to that kind of other evidence. And to me, that seems like an example of misology, because it's almost like you're so sure of your own feelings that then you're not really listening to kind of what the other experts are actually saying.
So what about the people who aren't necessarily experts or not necessarily considered to be highly intelligent? Why would those kind of people reject facts?
Well, there are lots of other reasons why that could be. I mean, one is the idea of cognitive miserliness. So this can actually afflict people of any level of intelligence. So it could affect someone with a low IQ or a high IQ, of low knowledge or high knowledge. And this is just the idea that we tend to prefer things that just make a lot of kind of intuitive sense, but we don't really want to think about the kind of reasons why that might be, or to explore the kind of counter arguments. Because if we have to think too much about something, we kind of feel that that's too difficult. Maybe we're just a bit lazy. Or it could just be this idea that kind of if you have to think a lot, then something has to be wrong. We do have a bias where we prefer I mean, it sounds crazy, but we really do have this kind of well-known bias that we prefer facts and statements that are fluent, cognitively fluent, they're easy to process. And we distrust things that take too much thought because we really feel that in itself is somehow a sign that something must be wrong. And so I think that can explain why people of all levels of intelligence sometimes reject facts that don't immediately fit their worldview because it takes too much thinking, and they're distrustful of something that takes too much thinking.
Well, that really is an issue because how can you ever learn anything new if you're afraid to think too much about anything?
Right. And that's the kind of other side of the coin. So I haven't, within my book, I haven't just looked at kind of why people make these stupid mistakes, but I've also looked at the converse and why some people do seem to form a more rational worldview, and they do seem to be more open to these new ideas. And one of those traits that can really protect you from all of these mistakes is curiosity, so intellectual curiosity. And you don't have to have a high IQ to be very curious, but the evidence shows that whatever your IQ, your curiosity can really predict how likely you are to form a rational opinion of, say, climate change or fracking or, the legalization of drugs. And it's because if you're curious, you're not threatened by something that needs more thought and more research. You actually relish that opportunity to find something new. And if it does disagree with your previous worldview, that doesn't have to kind of question your own kind of feelings of expertise, because it's just an opportunity to be intrigued, to be interested.
Okay, so I want to get into a quote from your blog post. This is a direct quote from your blog post.
Right.
We may sometimes find that our cherished beliefs were baseless without evidence. This is an inevitable consequence of thinking and learning. The rational behavior would be to update our knowledge and learn from our mistakes. But the misologist instead begins to distrust everything, even the true and verifiable facts that appear before his eyes. So distrust can only be bred in a misologist if their trust has been broken more than once before. So my question for you is a misologist really to blame if they've recognized a pattern and learned to follow it?
So that's a really good point. And so let me just think about that for a while, because I don't feel that misology ever should be a rational approach to life, but maybe it is understandable.
I mean, it's the same with a misanthrope, someone who hates other people. This is a person who's had bad experience, who's trusted multiple people throughout their lifetime, and that trust was broken over and over and over again. So, that's a pattern, and typically you learn from the patterns you recognize in your life. So, obviously this person maybe doesn't have the critical thinking skills to judge a person's character to begin with. But, how do you get out of that habit of trying to learn about people and about arguments based on the patterns that you've experienced? You've raised a really good point there. And so I guess throughout my book, I hope I'm not too judgmental of people who do fall into these patterns, because like you say, maybe it is a kind of reasonable expected behavior that if your fingers have been burnt, then you're kind of extra cautious the next time. And I think maybe one of the problems in modern society is that, so say, for example, if there is currently a greater distrust of scientists and journalists, now, which actually, lots of surveys do show is true. So this is a phenomenon. Now, my problem is that I think the errors that, say, journalists or scientists have made have been exaggerated by some parties, and they've been really brought to the forefront. So they're very salient. They're very easy to remember. And what's easy to forget, actually, is the vast amount of good that journalism and science has done for people.
And I think like maybe one of the problems here is that people do lose sight of the fact that, you know, without science, we would have a vastly reduced life expectancy. You know, we would still have to be terrified of infectious diseases, which now are really not a big threat for most people in the Western world. That, you know, cancer, which was once a kind of almost certain death sentence, you know, now like the kind of life expectancy, even if you have cancer, is vastly increased. These advances actually, I think, because they're kind of incremental over a long period, so they're very significant over a long period, but maybe not immediately visible and easy to notice that progress, are maybe lost. And so if people only remember some of the kind of highly documented cases where an expert has made a big error, for example, before the financial crash, if the forecasts didn't predict the crash, then maybe if those are too salient, then maybe that is what brings about misology. And maybe one of the ways to combat that would be to try to open your mind a little to all of that other progress that has been achieved.
Yeah, you're right. Among the different groups of experts, I personally feel like the scientific community has been hit especially hard by this wave of distrust among the public in the last few years. Why do you think that is the case for scientists specifically?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question because, to be honest, I can't think of any one particular scandal that should have produced the distrust in scientists. But I wonder if there has been this kind of almost a concerted attempt at misinformation on some fronts. So, for example, with climate change, for example, there are some lobby groups who I think are spreading kind of distrust about the science there. Same with anti-vaccination campaigners. I think, you know, some groups are deliberately, I think, spreading mistrust about the scientific evidence. And I just wonder if that has kind of reached a kind of critical point almost. And with social media, with Facebook and Twitter, it becomes a lot easier for that kind of message to spread far and wide.
Do you think the issue comes down to basically just a lack of scientific literacy among the public?
I do, actually. So I've also written a little bit about tests that are specifically of scientific literacy and also numeracy. And it's called the Berlin numeracy test. And it's very simple. You could even search for it online and you can try it for yourself. But actually, you know, it's really shocking how few, even very educated people, really struggle to interpret basic statistics, basic kind of health information or kind of information about risks concerning, for example, climate change or even just the weather, that really we do lack this kind of basic understanding that would help us to engage with the information that's given to us. And I think if you can engage with a news story, you can think critically about it, then that maybe does allow you to realize when you should be a bit more skeptical and when you should be a bit more trusting. And that in itself could maybe build a greater trust because you would begin to see all of the instances where maybe your trust is well founded and that actually the scientific evidence really does back up the claims that are being made.
Okay, well, I have this idea that the scientific community actually has a hand in the lack of scientific literacy among the public, and that, you know, how the results of research is disseminated in scientific journals. And who has access to these journals? Other scientists. There are some open access journals that the public can access if they want to. But, you know, I think most people just don't know these journals exist. They don't know how to learn about new discoveries or new research outside of the news. What do you think about that?
I think that's a really good point. And I mean, personally, I do feel that if, you know, scientists are receiving public money, they do have a responsibility to communicate their research with the public. And I certainly agree one aspect of that is that whether those papers that they're publishing are accessible to the public. But also as a science journalist, I know maybe lots of people would feel daunted about reading a scientific journal, but they would really like to kind of read a popular science article about a subject. You know, there is a genuine curiosity, I think, when things are explained clearly and accurately, but in a compelling way. You know, people really love science and they want to engage with it, even if they didn't enjoy science at school. So I think it is really important that scientists do actively try to increase that engagement, and they actively try to kind of communicate what they're doing.
How can they do that?
Well, sadly, sometimes as a journalist, I do talk to scientists, and they really, they don't want kind of journalistic articles to be written about their work even. And that kind of breaks my heart, that maybe they've had their fingers burned, and they, are worried that the article isn't going to be responsibly portray their work. But I still feel like maybe it is their responsibility, because they have the capacity to change people's worldviews and to really do a lot of good. It's not just a question of understanding a particular paper here. It's about helping people, like you said, to kind of increase their scientific literacy and to understand that there is a scientific way of looking at the world that could inform your politics and all of these other decisions. So I do think maybe just trying to engage more with kind of public outreach in whatever way possible, whether it's giving doing public speaking, whether it's writing popular articles yourself. There are so many good outlets now, such as The Conversation, that allow scientists to present their own research. And I think all of that can really be of a huge benefit to increasing the public understanding of science.
Okay. So this distrust of scientists and other academics or experts can be described as anti-intellectualism.
Right.
So how is anti-intellectualism different from misology?
Okay, I think they are very closely related, but I would say maybe anti-intellectualism is, misology is more specifically the distrust of kind of facts and arguments, and maybe anti-intellectualism is more this fear of this kind of intellectual elite, and this idea that, there are some people who are somehow in the know, and you kind of distrust them because they're kind of making these claims. So it's more of a distrust maybe of the person rather than the argument. And again, it's almost that feeling that if you have to try hard to understand that person's point of view, then maybe they're not worth listening to at all.
But you think there is a relationship between these two things?
I do, actually, because I think part of the, kind of like I just said, but that I think part of the distrust of kind of intellectual life is this kind of fear that that you're going to have to change your worldview in some way and change your opinions. And it's this kind of, you're closing your mind to something that's, you're kind of closing your mind to new information. And so I think that is at the heart of both anti-intellectualism and misology.
Okay, so we've talked about experts or particular specific individuals, but I'd like to know, why do people find it easier not to trust an entire institution or organization like the government?
So why do they find it easier not to trust the organization rather than, say, engaging with the
just
information?
Just completely write off an entire, institution, company, organization, NGO, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I really think that comes from, I think there's good kind of psychological evidence showing that this is particularly true of people who already feel quite vulnerable. They might be vulnerable kind of economically and socially. And that kind of breeds this kind of conspiracy mindset in a way, maybe because it's slightly tempting if you're in an unfortunate situation yourself to try to look for the kind of outside factors that might be kind of influencing your own situation. And so I feel like maybe there's an element of that with this distrust of, say, the government or an NGO. You kind of want to feel that there's this kind of alien body out there that could possibly be doing some shady dealings, maybe engaged in something that you're not quite certain of, but you feel like maybe that is having a broader impact on the world around you, and that breeds distrust. So there's definitely good psychological evidence showing that that's true of, say, political and even medical conspiracy theories. So the idea, for example, that, pharmaceutical companies are kind of actively hiding good cancer drugs so that because they know they can make more money from less effective drugs that would have to be used for a longer period of time. So I think that's definitely one element. I think it's also the case that if you don't understand what's going on, it can just feel very daunting to kind of look at that really complex body. And so you just kind of, your knee-jerk reaction is to think, well, there must be something dodgy going on there.
So then how do you develop the expertise you need to be able to critically judge arguments or experts or institutions without relying on the authority of an expert, of the person who's delivering those arguments?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, because actually, so my own point of view is that I feel like if someone is very knowledgeable and they have their credentials, that should play a part in whether you trust them or not. But you should be thinking about the kind of their argument itself critically as well. You can't just base all of your argument, all of your kind of beliefs on the trust of other people's credentials. You need to really look for yourself at kind of what they're saying and how that matches up. So, I mean, it's a tough one. I do think just like we discussed before, just generally improving your scientific literacy, your scientific knowledge can help. But that by itself isn't enough, actually, because there are some people who, as I'd mentioned, who are very knowledgeable and intelligent, but they still kind of have this distrust, this kind of blind spot in certain areas. But there has been some really fascinating research on, it's called cognitive inoculations. And this is specifically to combat the kind of misinformation that is being spread by anti-vaccination campaigners or climate change denialists. And so this, broadly speaking, it kind of presents some of the logical fallacies that those groups would use to try to kind of pull the wool over your eyes and to kind of create this illusion of evidence, or even the illusion of doubt about the actual verified evidence. And learning those kinds of logical fallacies, learning how to kind of think about them using basic critical thinking skills. So kind of, some of the examples would be to be wary, for example, of correlation studies and to look for what the underlying causation could be. So to look for alternative explanations. So these kind of inoculation courses, as they've been called, kind of look at all of those kinds of things. They look at the logical fallacies and the critical thinking skills. They teach people those skills. And then once people have seen these examples, they've kind of had really concrete examples of misinformation. They are much better at being able to spot it in the future. So those studies to me are very positive. They make me feel very optimistic because it shows that you really can teach people to think more critically for themselves so that they will accept the scientific consensus, they will accept the kind of correct information as we see it now, and they'll reject the misinformation.
Do you think someone needs to have a university-level education to be able to develop these critical thinking skills? I'm just asking because I wonder what kind of person would take these inoculation courses.
Right. No, I mean, absolutely not. I really think, actually, these are some of the most basic skills that we really should have been taught at school. But from my research for my book, my impression is that most schools really aren't good at teaching critical thinking. In fact, there have been studies showing that even across a university course, a 3-year degree, critical thinking skills basically stay exactly where they were. They don't increase at all. And these are actually very basic skills. You know, you don't need to be hugely intelligent or knowledgeable to know them. And I think they can be learned fairly quickly. You just need to put in a little bit of effort and to remember to use them in the future. I mean, the good thing is there are lots of online courses that do provide those kind of basics for you. You could also read, for example, the works of Carl Sagan. So he came up with this kind of baloney detection kit. And, you know, that is all across the web that you can look up, and you can find his kind of step-by-step guide. And just, you know, reading that kind of thing and making the effort to then apply that can really make a huge difference.
You've mentioned your book a few times now, so I'll just let our audience know that you have written a book. called The
Right.
Intelligence Trap, Why Smart People Make Stupid Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. And it's coming out in 2019. So in this book, you explore evidence-based wisdom, the opposite of misology. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Right, yeah. So, I mean, basically, evidence-based wisdom tries to look at all of these other skills that don't automatically come with intelligence, and they don't automatically come with kind of higher education. And so some of those are the things that we've already been talking about. So, for example, cultivating your curiosity, developing a more open-minded mindset so that you don't just accept the kind of easiest answer to a question, but you also try to really explore the alternative explanations. You really try to challenge yourself. You interrogate your own opinions. That also comes with this cognitive inoculation. So being able to spot when you might be being misled and to try to look for what the alternative explanations might be beyond the message that's kind of more simply conveyed in the article that you're reading. It also looks, for example, at the way companies could apply this in their own kind of organizations, because one of the big findings has been that certain corporate cultures can kind of actually discourage critical thinking amongst the organization's employees. And there could be some clever ways that organizations can subtly change their kind of message to their employees to encourage a more critical, a wiser kind of mindset.
So I'm curious to know, why doesn't intelligence actually correlate with rationality?
Right. I mean, yeah, there's really good research showing that it doesn't correlate very well at all. Being more intelligent, having a higher IQ can be an advantage in that it does help you to develop those kind of statistical or numerical skills. So there is a small correlation there, but there are still plenty of people who are very intelligent who are not very rational, according to all of these kind of scientific measures of rationality and cognitive bias. And so the reasons, it can be the cognitive miserliness, that kind of lazy thinking that we discussed earlier. So just because people have the kind of raw brain power doesn't actually mean they're going to use it. It's a bit like you might have been given a really fast car for your birthday. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to drive it very effectively. You might just kind of drive it into a ditch or off a cliff, or maybe you just don't actually drive it at all because you have no inclination. So that's kind of a parallel that I see with intelligence. Is like it could be useful if you have these other kind of traits that allow you to use your intelligence well. But if you don't, your intelligence could be not very useful, or it could even be damaging if you actually use it to kind of justify wrong opinions and beliefs.
So how do you suggest that we go about developing a greater intellectual humility?
Right, great question, because it's probably quite a difficult thing to do, in that I think that maybe the most intellectually arrogant people may well think they're the most humble as well. You see that quite a lot within these kind of self-reported scientific measures, that sometimes it's the people who are the least humble, or who have the biggest problem, who find it hardest to see. But one kind of fairly robust finding in the research has shown that people are more intellectually humble about a subject when they manage to disconnect that topic and their beliefs from their personal identity. Which maybe is easier said than done. But for example, climate change denialism is much more common amongst people who are more right-wing and capitalist in their politics. But actually, if you think about it logically, there's no real reason why the two show together. The facts are what they are. It doesn't have to be the case that global warming is a political issue. Learning to try to separate those two things could actually be very, very useful for developing the kind of intellectual humility, because that allows you to question and doubt yourself without kind of causing your whole sense of self to crumble around that one belief. You can realize you're still the same person, you're still a smart person, you're still an expert in other areas. But just because you've changed your opinion in this one area, it doesn't have to kind of question all of that other stuff about yourself.
Well, I am really excited to read your book. So can you let our audience know when exactly it will be available and where we can get it?
Absolutely. So it's being published in the UK in March 2019, but I'm sure that would be available in the US too. But the US version, which will be published by W.W. Norton, and that's also available in Canada, that will be coming out in August 2019.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yep, it's been a pleasure.
That was David Robson, senior journalist at BBC Future. He has a book coming out in 2019 called The Intelligence Trap: Why Smart People Make Stupid Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. Up next, we have Dr. Bruno Takahashi, Associate Professor of Environmental Journalism and Communication at Michigan State University.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show and podcast that explores everyday life from a scientific perspective. We are a member of the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on science and critical thinking. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to support us at Patreon, to connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, and to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. With me now is Dr. Bruno Takahashi, Associate Professor of Environmental Journalism and Communication at Michigan State University. Bruno, welcome to Science for the People.
Thank you, Anika.
All right, so now we've moved on to the segment of the episode that's about anti-intellectualism, and you co-authored a paper that was published a few years ago in the journal Public Understanding of Science. The paper is titled Media Sources, Credibility, and Public Perception of Science, Learning About How People Learn About Science. So tell us a little bit about this paper and why you wanted to write it.
Part of my interest in this topic is that there has been quite a robust body of research in the last few years looking at science communication, mostly criticizing the traditional model of communication, which we call the deficit model, that basically suggests that people in general, audiences in general, will make a right decision or will agree with the scientific community once they receive the appropriate information that they need. So they are illuminated and enlightened by this scientific information, and therefore they'll make the right decision, right? So in this paper, we wanted to explain and try to understand in a little bit more detail how do people make assumptions about science and how they learn about science based on first the media they consume, and second how much they trust that media and how much they trust scientists who produce the science that they're being exposed to. Because part of what we argue in the paper is that scientific understanding and scientific knowledge doesn't just happen because a scientist happens to tell an audience what research is telling them. There are a lot of different intervening factors at the individual and societal level that can lead to understanding or can lead to misunderstanding of science. So we're trying to somehow challenge this idea that either people are just going to get it once they get the information, or that people are really not prepared to understand scientific information. But that it's a little bit more complicated, and that there are many motivations and many factors within individuals, like political ideology or their media consumption, or again their level of trust in certain sources that explain in more nuanced way how people learn about science.
So what kind of role did you expect media consumption to have on whether a person understands or misunderstands scientific information?
Things have changed considerably in the last few decades with online media, with social media. Most of the models in science communication or in communication research in general were developed prior to online and social media. So what we're seeing in the last decade or so is that people learn about not only science but different topics from a pretty sophisticated diet of media sources. So no longer is a case where people just refer to one or two sources of information for a scientific topic, but now we get information from our friends, from a newspaper, from television, but also from maybe a scientist blog or a radio talk show. So there are a lot more sources of information. It is also true that people still follow those sources that align with their preconceived beliefs and their ideology. But the number of sources has certainly changed in the last few years. So it has certainly become more complicated to understand how media use, very broadly defined, has an effect on scientific knowledge.
Well, even considering the number of sources a person might look for, why might it be risky for someone to rely on the internet to make sense of scientific ideas or just complicated ideas?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I teach in the School of Journalism, and we tell our students that this is the best time to be a journalist and the most important time to be a journalist because, the internet certainly has opened up these floodgates, and it's difficult for most people to discern between credible and non-credible sources of information. And the role of journalists nowadays is, again, more important than ever because they're the ones who should be producing information that is fair, accurate, and objective. But it also takes science and media literacy for audience members to understand that information. So we're still working through that process of how do we make audience members become more literate in terms of consuming media, but also how do we train our journalists to step up a notch and produce information that it's even of higher quality than ever. And I would say that science journalism overall, the quality of those general traditional news sources, but also the specialized science sources, it's better than ever.
But why do you think scientific literacy is still so low in the U.S.?
Well, to be honest, scientific literacy hasn't changed that much in the U.S. In the last several decades. If you look at the data that the General Social Survey at the University of Chicago produces every year, science literacy hasn't changed that much. What has changed is the level of support for certain type of technologies or certain type of policies related to science. Attitudes have changed depending on the issue that you see, but literacy overall has remained somewhat stable, which is why it's so hard to change. I mean, we've been trying for a very long time to change to improve science literacy, but it hasn't really changed much. Now, I'm not an expert in the area of science education, and I would assume that that's where you would start at the very basic levels of education, elementary and middle school, so K through 12. So I mean, I know that there's a lot of work being done in that area, a lot of people working and doing research in that area. I would say that's where we would start, but the evidence suggests that it hasn't changed much in the last few decades.
So in your paper, you say that knowledge, attitude, and trust all work together to influence the public's understanding of science. So how are all three of these things different from each other, and how do they work together? So
the concept of trust, we call trust as a multi-dimensional concept. It includes a wide range of subcomponents. So you can trust information, but because you trust the source of the information, or you might distrust information because of the source, or you might trust the source, but you still distrust information because information that you are receiving is contrary to your own beliefs on a particular topic. So it's very very complex to understand this concept of trust. Now, for this particular paper, we were limited on the way that the questions were asked in the original survey. So we look at just trust or confidence in news media in general, in the press, which is something that has certainly declined. That is a lot. There's a lot of evidence that show that trust on the press has decreased considerably. So we wanted to understand what's the relationship between, again, consuming certain media sources and that level of confidence in the press and how that predicts scientific knowledge. So if you depending on what media source you consume, so let's say it's internet, online sources as your primary source of information, your level of confidence in the press or the traditional media, it tends to be lower. So there's kind of a negative relationship between online news consumption and confidence in the press, as opposed to using a traditional news source, right? Which is intuitive, kind of makes sense. So for those folks that use the internet, they trust the traditional media less, and that level of trust predicts lower levels of scientific knowledge. So in other words, we want people to be able to, regardless of what source of information they use, to trust traditional news media, which in turn can influence their level of scientific knowledge. People would be more willing to accept the information about science that they're receiving because they trust that source. And the same happens with perceptions of scientists. So if you trust scientists more, we predicted that should be related to how much people know about science. But what we actually found was a reverse relationship. So people who have higher levels of trust in scientists tend to have lower levels of science knowledge, which was kind of unexpected. But what we also found was that perceptions of scientists are influenced in a way, but by how much we trust the scientific process itself. So healthy skepticism was a positive predictor of scientific knowledge. So knowing more about the scientific process, it's a good thing. You become more skeptical, which is not a bad thing. Being skeptical in science is actually something that drives science. So we want people to be somewhat skeptical of science itself, but that they trust the process, that they trust the fact that scientists are operating under certain circumstances and using certain tools that allow them to produce information and results that are meaningful and that are trustworthy.
So take me through the different types of methods you used in the study to get an understanding of what influences a person's scientific knowledge.
So we use secondary data for this study. Actually, as I mentioned the General Social Survey a few minutes ago, and that's the data we used. I can't remember. I think it's a 2015 data set from the General Social Survey. So this is a national representative sample of U.S. Residents. I can't remember the sample size at this point, but what we did is we used a path analysis to look at the relationships between the variables, the independent variables and dependent variables. So we look at, we control for things like demographics, like age, gender, and education. And we look at direct relationships between all of these variables, so interest in science, media use, and the levels of trust. So direct relationships with scientific knowledge. But we also look at mediated relationships between the variables. So again, whether the use of a media source predicts scientific knowledge through the level of trust in the press or the perceptions of scientists. So that in a nutshell is the method that we used.
So what kind of relationship do you think age, gender, and education have with having an interest in science?
Our study is consistent with many studies in science communication show that higher education is positively related to interest in science. So more educated folks, so higher degrees, graduate degrees tend to be correlated with interest in science. We also see that older people are more interested in science. So the older the individual is, the higher the interest in science, which again, that's all consistent with research in this area. Males tend to be more interested in science than females, again, which is consistent with most of the research.
So do you think the type of media source, say traditional media versus just using the internet, could affect the accuracy of the information that people can receive, if they were to choose one or the other?
It's possible. It's possible. It depends on the media. When you talk about mainstream media, it depends on which media you're being exposed to. So the research in communication shows that consuming television has a different type of effect that reading the newspaper. So for example, for individuals with high education, consuming news in general, not only science, but it applies to all types of news. Consuming news from TV for people with higher education doesn't make a lot of difference, but it does help people with lower education. So the gap in knowledge between those with high education and low education tends to close where they're exposed to television, but the contrary happens when they're exposed to newspapers. So because newspapers just require a higher cognitive level to understand the information, so the gap between those who already have some knowledge and those who have limited knowledge tends to widen. So people with more knowledge get more out of a newspaper than people with lower levels of knowledge. So there's a lot of nuances in terms of what traditional media you're exposed to. Now, when you go to online news, it gets even more complicated because, again, the availability of information is just so vast. It's huge that it's hard to measure exactly what is a particular media diet of any given individual, right? So I could be reading both the New York Times, Fox News Online, NPR, but also I'm reading news sources back in my home country in Peru. I might be reading specialized news, environmental news like Inside Climate News. So it's a very unique media diet as compared to what you might be consuming or my colleagues or my friends might be consuming. There are certain patterns that we do identify again in terms of the ideological leanings of the news sources, but each individual will have a particular media diet. So we're exposed to a very unique reality. So we're not longer exposed to the same reality from back when we only have a few newspapers and a few networks that presented us what's going on around the world. Now we are each exposed to something kind of unique. So it's really difficult to measure those levels of exposure and to really determine how that media consumption is affecting people's understanding of science or their beliefs or their attitudes. I mean, there's plenty of research, but it's all both issue dependent and again depending on the media diet of the individuals.
Well, one factor you focused on in this study is a pre-existing interest in science. So, as well as you looked at positive or negative perception of both scientists and journalists. My question is, how can someone become interested in science in the first place?
That's a good question. So, again, that's something I think that maybe somebody in science education would be better posed to answer, but I'll try to comment on that. In that we're born into this world being curious, right? We're basically scientists when we are born. When we're kids, we have that natural curiosity to try to understand how the world works. That's why we, as toddlers and little kids, would put forks inside of electric outlets, right? We just want to know what's going to happen. And we put things in our mouths because we want to know how they taste or what will happen, right? So we're naturally inclined to being curious. And that's what drives science, right? This sense of curiosity, of wonder, of trying to understand how the world works. Now, as we grow older, we are socialized into a system that in many cases prevents us from being curious and tries to bound our actions by telling us these things you can do, these things you can't do, right? And we need those boundaries, absolutely. But in many cases that takes away our sense of curiosity and exploration. For some people, it never goes away, and those are again those people who pursue careers in science. But I think that in part of the issues that we're telling our kids not to explore, not to take risks because we're worried that they may get hurt. which is why we see has been a risk. People are being overly risk averse in even the simplest things in life. Now I think I'm talking like a parent right now, but I think that there's a little bit of that it's driving the maybe that lack of curiosity. I mean, there are still a lot of people who are interested in science, of course. I mean, and I can think of off the top of my head what are the percentages of individuals who go into careers in STEM. But we do know is that it's different depending on who you are in terms of your race or ethnicity or your gender or your upbringing, your socioeconomic status. So for some people, the opportunities are more readily available than for people with certain characteristics, which is something that I know that people in science education are working on.
So I want to actually get back to your study. So you already touched on a little bit on some of the results, but I'd like to ask you what you think the most interesting results of your study were.
That's a good question.
I mean, I have some ideas, but I thought I'd let you speak first.
Well, I mean, so again, I think that the main takeaway is that, especially for people doing science communication, whether they are scientists or whether they are science museums, I think it provides a little bit more nuance to the idea that if people don't learn about science after they're being exposed to it, it's not because they don't get it, that they're stupid, or that they don't care. It's a lot more complicated than that. So there are structural factors that lead to people's interest or knowledge about science, and those include, again, as I mentioned, societal perceptions of the role of the press in our societies and the role of science in our society. I mean, this interview is about anti-intellectualism, and it's I think I would agree that there is a sense of anti-intellectualism in North America. I won't say that the evidence, it's clear that people reject science, because again, I think that there's still not a lot of clarity on that topic, but there's a sense that something is going on. Like, we hear it from our policymakers, from the politicians. We hear it from various different sources that the role of science is being challenged. So I think that will be the main takeaway, that if you're if you're a science communicator interested in getting people to learn about science, it's not just about feeding people facts and expecting them to just get it. You have to understand where people are coming from.
So how do you think the results of your study can help explain anti-intellectualism and why this attitude has been targeted at scientists and journalists in particular?
I think it's a part of it's a reflection of distrust on institutions more generally. I mean, which is not unexpected, really. But I think that we have to think about the issue of anti-intellectualism not only from the perspective of the general public as being the culprits of this, or specific policymakers. Well, maybe in some cases there are some specific individuals, but we have to look at it also from the perspective of what role have scientists played in feeding this sense of anti-intellectualism. And again, this fits with a lot of the research that many of my colleagues conduct in science communication that show that the ways in which scientists and people in science talk to the public and communicate about their science or their findings to the general public is probably not the best. That there are a lot of ways to communicate science by being respectful and not being a jerk, that can lead to dialogue. I mean, so those who ask, if you're talking about communication, you need at least two individuals to have a process of communication, and you cannot just expect, because you're doing research in an area and you have the knowledge on a topic that you can just talk to people any way you want and be condescending, because that's not going to lead to dialogue. So I worry a little bit about our focus on anti-intellectualism solely on audiences and again, this is all about the deficit model, right? Or challenging the deficit model. Think about people as empty vessels or being dumb and not getting it. So we gotta meet people where they are and be able to engage them in a conversation.
So one of the most interesting results I found from your study is that I think the result was that people who are interested in science will use the internet to learn more about it. But then from using the internet, they'll develop that negative perception.
Okay, right. So I think that part of it is that, yes, you're interested in science, you're interested in science, you will go and seek more information. You will learn more about the whatever science topic you are, but maybe because, again, the internet is this kind of wild west of information, your actual scientific knowledge might decrease because you are being exposed to information that is inaccurate. Now, the way we measure scientific knowledge is just with a very basic scale, asking basic questions about science. We are careful in how we interpret the results because there's always a possibility that the measuring instrument is not the best for this particular model. But we speculate is that it's possible that exposure to internet sources, if they are not accurate, might lead to not a decline, but at least not an increase in scientific knowledge.
So you were saying before that scientists haven't been doing a very good job with communicating to the public about their research because, some scientists tend to be condescending and act like jerks. So what do you think scientists can do to kind of help turn this tide of anti-intellectualism around and gain the trust of the public?
So there's the research in science communication. Now it's focusing on a couple of different things. So we first started focusing on basic skills, right? So how to communicate, like how to make a presentation, how to talk to a reporter, how to conduct a workshop, or how to write a blog post, how to create a social media page, right? So those are skills. Those are technical skills. And that's good. The scientists need to understand that getting rid of their jargon in their public communication it's something that they have to do. There's no way around it. Otherwise, people are not going to understand what they're saying. But that's just part of it, right? So being good communicators is part of it. But the second aspect that I think it's important to keep in mind, and it's an area that some of us are working on, is to look at communication goals. So what is it that we want to achieve with our communication, right? So what are the end goals for communication? And you mentioned one of them is to gain trust, okay? But there are others such as other goals such as defending science, okay? There's a goal of influencing policy. There's a goal of increasing levels of interest in science, so getting more maybe minorities into STEM careers. So those are just some examples of potential goals for the communication that scientists engage in. So it has to be, in other words, strategic. It has to be strategic communication. Communication just for the sake of communication not always works. So scientists need to be able to define what is it that they want to achieve. And then use those skills that they might have learned at a workshop or from their colleagues and put those to practice with the end goal in sight. Otherwise, again, it might work, but it might not. So it's important to keep in mind strategic goals.
All right. Bruno, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anika.
If you want to learn more about David Robson or Bruno Takahashi, you can check out their links in social media on our website at www.scienceforthepeople.ca. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on Science for the People.
Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Witten and consulting support from Desiree Schell. Our frequently seen guest hosts are Marion Kilgour, Anika Hazra, and Jessica Yaros. Our theme song is called Binary Consequence, and it was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern. Science for the People is entirely listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount, or you can send us a one-time donation in any amount via the donate page of our website. Science for the People is created in partnership with the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skeptic at skeptic.org. The show is hosted by science news writer Bethany Brookshire and me, Rochelle Saunders.